You're listening to Mr. DarXnights, where even the warmest homes can turn to ice, and the softest smiles can hide the deepest horrors. Tonight, I'll tell you a story, not born from legend or shadow, but from the very heart of small-town America, a story that unfolded not on a battlefield, but in a living room. A day meant for celebration became a final chapter. It began like any other quiet spring morning in Johnson Lake, Nebraska, a place so peaceful that people often forgot to lock their doors, where neighbors still waved from their porches, and the loudest sound was the rustling of cornstalks in the wind. This was the kind of place where people said, "Nothing bad ever happens here." Until May 10th, 2025. The Koch family had lived there for years. Jeremy, the father, was a quiet, clean-cut man in his mid-40s, often seen mowing the lawn with headphones on, rarely speaking unless spoken to. His wife, Marie, was the kind who baked cookies for church events and knew every child's birthday on the block. They had two boys, Dylan, 18, who was set to graduate that very morning from Eustis Farnham High School, and Caleb, 14, still awkwardly stuck between boyhood and adolescence. Their two-story lakefront house stood like a picture from a Hallmark movie. White picket fence, blue shutters, bird feeders on the porch. That house had seen Christmas mornings, birthday balloons, laughter, and soon it would see something far darker. Because behind that perfect suburban image was something no neighbor could ever have guessed. Something waiting, brewing. It started with silence. The morning of Dylan's graduation, guests began to arrive at the school auditorium. Families buzzed with excitement. Teachers straightened their robes. But one seat in the front row, marked "Reserved, Koch Family," stayed empty. The ceremony began without them, assuming traffic, a last-minute delay. But as Dylan's name was called, there was no one to cheer. No mother to cry, no father to clap, no brother to wave. Just silence. Principal Reardon, who had known the family for years, began to feel uneasy. He texted Marie. No reply. He called Jeremy. Straight to voicemail. By noon, he called the Dawson County Sheriff's Office for a welfare check. Just a precaution, he said. No one expected what they would find. Deputy Carter arrived first. He noticed the house was too quiet. The porch light, oddly, was on, in daylight. The mailbox was stuffed. And yet, the front door was unlocked. That was unusual. He stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Not rot, not yet, but something off. Like iron in the air. Something heavy. Something final. The living room was perfectly arranged. Throw pillows in place. A plate of uneaten cinnamon rolls on the table, still warm. But the silence was deeper than any silence he'd known. He found the bodies in the upstairs hallway. Marie first, lying face down just outside the master bedroom, blood pooled beneath her head. A single gunshot to the back. Dylan was in his bedroom, dressed in his cap and gown. The tassel still dangled from his mortarboard. He was seated at the edge of his bed, slumped forward, blood soaking through his shirt. Caleb was in the bathroom, the shower running cold, steam long gone. His small frame curled against the wall. All had been shot once. Precisely. Quietly. Jeremy was in the garage. A .45 caliber pistol still gripped in his right hand. A note duct-taped to the workbench. It read, "They deserved better than what was coming. I couldn't save them, so I stopped the pain before the world could bring it. I'm sorry." The media would later call it a tragic murder-suicide, but the town knew it was something darker. No signs of struggle. No cries. No escape attempts. It was as if each family member had been taken out with the precision of someone who'd planned it all. And the most disturbing part, Jeremy had never shown a single sign. In fact, neighbors recalled him smiling just 2 days earlier at the hardware store, buying paint. Marie had posted a photo on Facebook of Dylan trying on his graduation robe. Caleb had been seen playing basketball in the driveway that same afternoon. And yet, 48 hours later, they were all gone. There were whispers, of course. Some said Jeremy had lost his job 6 months earlier and hadn't told his family. That he'd been drowning in debt. Others claimed he'd become obsessed with apocalyptic theories online, that he believed something terrible was coming and had to save his family from it. But none of it made sense. How does a father sit down and decide that the only way to protect his children is to murder them in their sleep? How does a man turn a day meant for pride into a grave? Police tried to piece together the timeline. They estimated the murders took place between 2:30 and 4 a.m. The cinnamon rolls, found still warm, suggested Marie had woken up early to bake. She may have been the first. Dylan, judging by the lack of struggle, likely never saw it coming. Caleb, they found water in his lungs, indicating he was alive when shot, possibly mid-shower. No screams were heard. No neighbors saw anything. The dog, a golden retriever named Bailey, was found unharmed in the basement, whimpering behind the dryer, as if someone had locked her away on purpose. Jeremy's suicide was clean. A single shot to the temple. But what haunted the coroner was his expression, not of peace, but of focus. As if he died still believing he'd done the right thing. The town of Johnson Lake went into collective mourning. Candlelight vigils. GoFundMe memorials. Church sermons begging for answers. But no answer ever came. Just the echo of a father's choice that shattered every illusion of safety the town once held. And still, no one understood why. That's where the story should have ended. But it didn't. Because 3 weeks later, strange reports began trickling in. First, from Deputy Carter himself. He claimed that while driving by the Coke House during a routine patrol, he saw the porch light flick on by itself, even though power to the house had been cut for 2 weeks. Then, a local mail carrier swore she saw someone standing in the upstairs window, wearing a graduation gown. The house was boarded up. Empty. Yet something remained. Local kids dared each other to knock on the door. Some claimed they heard piano music coming from inside. Others, voices, whispers, a woman crying. But the most disturbing account came from a real estate agent named Angela, sent to assess the home's value. She entered the house mid-afternoon, alone, flashlight in hand. The walls had already begun to yellow with heat damage. Furniture covered in white sheets. But as she ascended the staircase, she swore she heard footsteps. Slow. Behind her. Then, a voice. Small. Male. Whispering. I didn't want to die. Angela ran. She didn't return to that house. Not for the final photos. Not for the sale. She left Nebraska 3 weeks later, telling friends she couldn't sleep. That something had followed her. That she saw a boy in the mirror. Every night at 2:45 a.m. It's the exact time police believe Dylan died. Now, the Coke House sits abandoned. Grass overgrown. Mailbox gone. The windows, though boarded, seem to breathe in moonlight. And some say if you walk by just before dawn, you'll hear a graduation song playing softly from the second floor. But no one's ever upstairs. No one living, anyway. This was only the beginning of what happened in Johnson Lake. What came next was far worse. Jeremy Koch had prepared for this day long before anyone knew it was coming. The house, the family, the picture-perfect life they all led, it was all part of the plan. A plan that no one ever suspected until it was too late. The police dug deeper into Jeremy's past. They didn't just find the usual signs of a man struggling with debt or job loss. They found something far darker, something that painted him as more than just a broken father. It seemed that, for years, Jeremy had been preparing for the day that would come when he would end his family's life, all to spare them from a fate he believed was inevitable. In the weeks following the murders, investigators discovered that Jeremy had been obsessed with a set of increasingly bizarre and apocalyptic theories. It wasn't just that he'd lost his job at a manufacturing plant 6 months before the tragedy. It was the way he'd retreated into himself, spending long nights on the computer, reading obscure forums and watching conspiracy videos. He'd filled notebooks with lists of dates, cryptic symbols, and sketches of strange phenomena that, to most people, seemed like nonsense. But to Jeremy, they were undeniable truths. He had come to believe that the world was on the verge of collapse, that a terrible event was about to unfold, one that would destroy everything he loved. And the only way to protect his family from this future was to end their lives on his own terms, before the world did it for them. He believed that he was doing them a favor. A merciful favor. In the days after the murders, investigators found strange things in the house. A hidden journal in Jeremy's bedroom, scribbled with frantic thoughts, detailed his beliefs. On one page, he had written, "They'll be the first to suffer when it all ends. But I'll take that pain from them. I'll end it now, while they're still innocent." It was a chilling confession of a mind spiraling into delusion. And yet, despite the disturbing words, there was a cold clarity to it. Jeremy was convinced he was saving his family from something worse than death. As the police continued their investigation, the house itself began to hold its own secrets. A week after the bodies were found, a local contractor, hired to board up the house and prepare it for sale, walked through the empty rooms, trying to make sense of the tragedy. When he reached the master bedroom, he noticed something odd. The window, which had been shut and locked, was slightly ajar. Not much, just enough for a breeze to slip through. Curious, he stepped closer, peering out into the yard. That's when he noticed something else. The grass. It had been freshly mowed. The lawn had been cut recently, but Jeremy had been dead for over a week. He backed away from the window, unnerved. Then he heard it. A soft sound, almost like a whisper. He stood still, straining his ears. It was faint, but it was there. A voice. It came from somewhere inside the house. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the voice of a child. A boy. The kind of voice that sent a chill creeping down your spine. The contractor left the house that day without saying a word to anyone. He didn't even finish the job. He simply walked away, and he never returned. Meanwhile, local kids, daring each other, had started sneaking into the coke house. They went through the broken windows, explored the dark rooms, and dared each other to spend the night inside. And every one of them came back with the same story. They had heard something, whispers, footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of a boy calling out in the dark. Some swore they heard a piano playing in the upstairs room. Others said they saw someone standing in the window at night. A figure in a graduation gown, staring out into the yard, unmoving. But when they returned the next day, the house was empty. No one was there. The most disturbing story came from a young girl named Samantha, who had been friends with Dylan Koch. She had gone to the house one evening with a group of friends, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary ghost that everyone was talking about. They dared each other to go up to the second floor, where Dylan's room was. As they stepped onto the creaky staircase, Samantha felt a sudden pressure on her chest. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pushing down on her. She reached the top of the stairs and froze. There, at the far end of the hallway, was a figure standing in the doorway of Dylan's room. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, but his face was obscured by shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. Samantha tried to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. The fear gripped her so tightly that she couldn't breathe. Her friends didn't seem to notice anything unusual. They laughed and joked, oblivious to the figure. But Samantha knew what she had seen. And when she ran out of the house, the figure was still there, standing motionless, as if it was waiting for something. Waiting for her. The police, of course, dismissed these stories as nothing more than rumors. But the strange events around the Koch house continued. People talked of seeing the family's car parked in the driveway late at night, only for it to be gone by morning. One neighbor even reported seeing Marie, the mother, standing in the front yard in a white dress, staring into the distance, as if waiting for something. But no one had ever seen the Koch family again. Not alive, anyway. The house was eventually sold, though it sat vacant for years. No one stayed there for long. The few who tried spoke of strange happenings, of a presence that couldn't be explained, and eventually they too left. The house was eventually abandoned once more. And the stories, they only grew. The whispers, the shadowy figure in the window, the piano playing late at night, the boy in the graduation gown. Some say that the Koch family never left, that they're still there, trapped in the house, reliving the final moments of their lives over and over again. Some say that if you stand outside the house on a quiet night, you can hear the faint sound of a graduation song playing through the walls. But no one dares to go near it anymore. Because some things, some stories, are best left undisturbed. But remember, if you ever find yourself in Johnson Lake, Nebraska, and you happen to walk by the old Coke House, look up at the second-floor window. You might just see a figure standing there, waiting. The nights around the old Coke House grew colder, and the stories darker. It wasn't just the people of Johnson Lake who whispered about the house anymore. It was the people who had lived there, the souls of those who never truly left. It was said that those who dared to step inside after dark could hear the faint, mournful melody of a piano drifting from the second floor. Others claimed to see shadows moving across the windows. But no one was brave enough to investigate. Everyone in town knew better than to go near that house. Everyone, except for one person, Detective Frank McAllister. A year had passed since the murders. The case was cold, unsolved, and the police had moved on. But Frank couldn't let go. Something gnawed at him. Something about the Koch family didn't sit right, and the town's collective silence only deepened his suspicion. Frank was the kind of man who didn't trust what he saw on the surface. He had worked cases for too long to ignore the whispers. One rainy night, Frank found himself standing in front of the Koch house, his coat drenched and his breath visible in the cold air. The house stood in front of him, almost mocking him with its dark, empty windows. He hadn't intended to visit it that evening. But here he was, staring at the very place that had consumed his thoughts for months. He reached for his flashlight, a steady beam slicing through the blackness. His heart thudded louder in his chest. Something was off about this house. Something had always been off. The stories, the strange happenings, the missing family, it didn't add up. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the stale air hit him like a wall. He stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating the dusty hallway. Every step he took echoed through the empty house. There was no one here. No shadows. No figures. No whispers. Yet, as he walked deeper into the house, the temperature dropped. The air grew thicker. He couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. He reached the staircase, where the floorboards creaked under his weight. The sound was almost too loud. The walls seemed to close in around him, and as he stepped onto the second floor, his breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. A faint noise, barely audible, came from the far end of the hallway. A sound like a child crying? No. It was too soft, too distant, but unmistakable. He moved towards it, his footsteps growing heavier as the silence around him thickened. The air felt cold now, a biting chill that he could feel on his skin. His flashlight flickered, and the beam danced erratically across the walls. When he reached the door to Dylan's room, the crying stopped. Everything stopped. Frank reached for the doorknob. His heart was pounding in his chest. The moment his hand touched the metal, the door swung open, seemingly of its own accord, revealing the room within. It was almost exactly how it had been described by the few who'd ventured inside. The room was untouched, the furniture still arranged as if someone had just left it. But there was something wrong with the room, something that made Frank's stomach twist. There, in the corner of the room, was an old piano. Its keys were yellowed and chipped, its wood scratched and weathered. But it was the faint sound of a melody that filled the air, the same song that was said to play through the walls at night. Frank stepped closer, the floor creaking under his boots. The piano keys moved on their own, as if being played by invisible hands. He stopped in his tracks, his breath hitching in his throat. A figure stood by the piano. A shadow. No, not a shadow. A person. A man. But his features were obscured, as if hidden beneath a dark veil. Frank's mouth went dry, his body frozen in place. He tried to speak, to call out, but the words wouldn't come. The figure turned to face him, its face a blur. A blank, featureless void where eyes should have been. The air around Frank thickened, the pressure in the room increasing, suffocating him. The piano played faster now, a frantic, discordant tune that echoed in his skull. His head ached as he stumbled backward, and suddenly the figure spoke. "You're too late." The voice wasn't human. It was a distorted whisper, like the scratching of nails on glass, and it reverberated through the room, making Frank's skin crawl. The figure reached out, its arms stretching unnaturally long. Frank could feel the weight of its presence, the oppressive sense that whatever this was, it wasn't meant to be here. It didn't belong. And then, in a blur of motion, the figure lunged forward, and everything went black. When Frank woke up, he was lying in the middle of the hallway, his head throbbing and his body aching. The house was silent again. The air had cleared. He sat up, disoriented, unsure of how much time had passed. His flashlight lay beside him, still flickering weakly. The door to Dylan's room was closed. He stood, trembling, and stepped back to the door. This time, it didn't open on its own. It was locked. But he knew what he had seen. The figure, the music, the emptiness. It was all connected. But before he could gather his thoughts, a soft sound drifted down the hallway. Footsteps. Someone was walking upstairs. Frank spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing. The house was empty, still, quiet. But the footsteps continued, moving toward him. He could feel them getting closer. The silence was shattered by the sound of a child's voice. "Help me!" It was faint, almost lost in the creaks of the old house. But Frank knew what he had to do. He rushed toward the stairs, driven by an instinct that he couldn't explain. He was being pulled toward something that had been hidden in this house for far too long. He reached the top of the stairs and froze. There, at the end of the hallway, the door to Dylan's room stood ajar. He could hear the piano again. The same song, the same melody. But now, it was joined by the sound of a child crying. Frank didn't hesitate. He stepped toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he crossed the threshold, something heavy pressed down on him. The air became thick again, suffocating, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward him. And then, in the middle of the room, there it was. The figure. The same man. No face. No features. Just the sound of the piano, growing louder, until it consumed everything. It was too late. He had stepped into the trap. There was no escape. Frank's last thought before the darkness overtook him was that the Koch family had never left. They were here, trapped in the walls, in the music, in the house itself. And now he was too. The house had claimed another victim. But the story doesn't end there. You see, the town of Johnson Lake is small, and rumors spread quickly. People still talk about the house, about the figure, about the whispers in the night. And there are still those who dare to visit, seeking the truth, or perhaps just a thrill. But the truth is this: the house is still there. The figure still waits. And if you ever find yourself passing through Johnson Lake, Nebraska, don't stop. Because there's one thing you need to remember. The Koch family never left. And neither will you. End of Story 1. Story 2. It was a sunny afternoon in Miami's Wynwood neighborhood, known for its vibrant street art and bustling streets. But that day, the air wasn't filled with the usual lively chatter or the sounds of music from nearby cafes. Instead, there was a tension, an unmistakable feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. It all started with something so trivial, it almost seems impossible that it could spiral into violence. A parking spot. A spot that seemed ordinary, unimportant, until two men found themselves locked in a heated argument over it. Anthony Russian, a 34-year-old man with a history of violent outbursts, had been circling the area, searching for a space to park. And there it was, the perfect spot, right near the sidewalk, under the bright Miami sun. But as Anthony began to pull in, a silver sedan cut in front of him, taking the very space he had been waiting for. The driver of the sedan, later identified as 39-year-old Marcus Reed, got out casually, unaware of the fury he had just sparked. But for Anthony, it was as if the world had stopped. His pulse quickened, his hands gripped the steering wheel, and a wave of anger clouded his thoughts. What followed was a confrontation that escalated quickly. Words were exchanged, insults, threats, and the situation intensified. Onlookers, witnessing the altercation, described it as a verbal fight, with neither man willing to back down. But it wasn't just words anymore. Anthony, in a moment of rage, reached into his car. Marcus didn't see it coming. In an instant, Anthony pulled out a handgun, and without hesitation, fired several shots, hitting Marcus in the chest. The loud crack of the gunshots echoed through the street, sending pedestrians scattering in fear. Marcus collapsed immediately, blood pouring onto the pavement. The scene went from shocking to chilling. Anthony didn't flee. Instead, he stood there, watching Marcus fall, as though in disbelief at what had just transpired. It wasn't until he heard the sirens, the unmistakable sound of the police closing in, that he finally decided to leave the scene, but not before leaving behind a victim fighting for his life. Marcus was rushed to the hospital, barely clinging to life. The gunshots had damaged his vital organs, but against the odds, he survived. Anthony was arrested shortly after, his mugshot showing a man whose life had just crumbled over something as petty as a parking space. When questioned, Anthony's response was chilling. He claimed he didn't intend to kill Marcus, but in his mind, he was justified in his actions. The dispute had, in his eyes, escalated to something far beyond reason. But the truth remained undeniable. An argument over a parking spot had turned into an attempted murder. The entire incident was caught on camera by a nearby security system, a recording that would later haunt anyone who watched it. Anthony Russian, now facing multiple charges, was held in custody, his future uncertain. In the weeks that followed, the city of Miami would be left grappling with the fallout, a life shattered over a dispute so small, yet so deadly. Marcus Reed's survival was a miracle, but the psychological scars would stay with him forever. As for Anthony, the question was no longer about parking spots. It was about the rage inside him, a rage that turned a seemingly normal day into a nightmare for all involved. And the eerie truth remains. Sometimes, it's not about the reason behind the violence, but the violence itself. When anger clouds the mind, even the smallest provocation can lead to tragedy. As the hours passed since the violent confrontation in Wynwood, the city began to buzz with whispers. Miami's bustling streets and colorful murals were far from where the story ended. The argument over a simple parking spot had gone from petty to horrifying, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. News of the shooting spread quickly, and soon, everyone in the city was talking about it, but none of them could truly comprehend the depth of the tragedy that had just unfolded. Anthony Russian, the man responsible for the shooting, had been taken into custody, his life unraveling in the blink of an eye. But what about Marcus Reed? What would happen to him? In the aftermath of the shooting, Marcus was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. His blood stained the pavement where he had collapsed, the evidence of a fight for something as trivial as a parking space. His family was left in shock, unable to make sense of the violence that had shattered their lives. Marcus had been known as a kind man, a person who didn't involve himself in conflict. Yet, here he was, lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life after an encounter that should have never happened. At first, it seemed like a miracle. The doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him. He had been shot multiple times, with one of the bullets grazing his lung and another narrowly missing his heart. The trauma was immense, but Marcus had always been strong. Despite the critical condition, his body seemed determined to fight back. But the physical wounds weren't the only scars Marcus would have to deal with. His family members stood by his side, but the emotional toll was just beginning. The anger and the frustration swirled within them as they waited for answers. Why had this happened? What had driven Anthony Russian to such extreme measures? As the days passed, Marcus remained unconscious, drifting in and out of consciousness, unaware of the world around him. The hospital room became a place of prayer and desperation, with his family praying for a miracle. But each time the doctors entered, they carried grim news. His chances of recovery were slim, they said. The trauma was too severe. Meanwhile, Anthony's life had already begun to crumble. In the hours after the shooting, he was arrested and taken into custody. But even as he sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, he was unable to grasp the consequences of his actions. His face remained stoic, emotionless, like a man who had shut himself off from the reality of what he had just done. He was charged with attempted murder, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses had seen the entire incident unfold. Surveillance footage had captured the confrontation, the gunshot, and Marcus falling to the ground. There was no question about what had happened. But Anthony, in his defense, claimed that he hadn't intended to shoot Marcus. He simply had lost control. The officers in the interrogation room listened to his words carefully, but they weren't convinced. Anthony Russian's past had a long history of violent outbursts. He had a reputation in his community, one that wasn't hard to trace. It wasn't the first time he'd allowed his anger to spill over into violence, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But this time, it was different. This time, he had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. As the days went by, the media continued to cover the case, making headlines every time new details emerged. People in Miami were horrified, unable to fathom how something as minor as a parking spot could turn into a life-and-death struggle. The questions began to mount. What had set Anthony off? What had caused him to react so violently to a simple disagreement? The media sought answers, but none seemed forthcoming. As for Marcus, his family clung to hope. They refused to believe that the man they knew could be taken from them over something so senseless. They were there every day, by his side, watching as he struggled to regain consciousness. But the road to recovery was long, and the physical scars left behind by the bullets would forever be a reminder of the violence that had occurred. It wasn't until nearly a week later that Marcus finally woke up. His eyes fluttered open, and he took a few moments to process where he was. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the hospital lights. His family was there, hovering anxiously at his bedside, waiting for any sign of recognition. His mother was the first to speak. "Marcus, baby, you're awake." "Thank God." But Marcus didn't respond right away. He blinked a few times, trying to focus. His head was pounding, his body aching from the wounds he had sustained. The feeling of weightlessness lingered in his mind, and he struggled to remember what had happened. Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You're in the hospital, Marcus," his mother replied gently. "You were shot, but you're going to be okay. You're safe now." He nodded slowly, still disoriented. But the question that lingered in his mind had nothing to do with his own survival. It had to do with the man who had done this to him. He could hardly remember the face of the person who had pulled the trigger, but he knew one thing for certain. He needed to know why. Meanwhile, Anthony's trial loomed on the horizon. The weight of the charges against him was heavy. It wasn't just attempted murder anymore. It was an act of violence that had shaken an entire community. The city of Miami had watched as the story unfolded, and now it seemed like everyone had an opinion about what should happen to him. But the trial wasn't just about Anthony's fate. It was about what it meant to live in a world where something as trivial as a parking spot could set off a violent chain of events. The more the public learned about Anthony's past, his history of temper issues, his violent tendencies, his inability to control his anger, the more they began to question how such rage could be ignored for so long. As the trial date drew closer, Anthony's defense team began to prepare their case. They argued that Anthony had acted out of a moment of panic, that he hadn't meant to shoot Marcus. They claimed it had been an accident, a terrible mistake made in a moment of poor judgment. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. The video footage told a different story. The surveillance cameras had captured everything, from the initial argument to the final, horrific shot. The image of Marcus falling to the ground, blood spreading across the pavement, was clear. There was no mistaking what had happened. And yet, as the trial progressed, the defense continued to paint a picture of a man who had snapped. They tried to shift the blame, to make it about everything except Anthony's own actions. But the people of Miami weren't so easily swayed. And in that courtroom, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a parking dispute. It was about the dark side of human nature, the fragility of patience, the consequences of unchecked anger, and the tragic results when rage consumes a person. Anthony Russian had let his anger take control, and now Marcus Reed was paying the price. As the days grew longer, the trial became a spectacle. The public's anger swelled, and the streets of Miami buzzed with talk of the case. The tragedy that had unfolded over something so small had now become something much larger, a reflection of the violence that lurked beneath the surface of every argument, every confrontation. The final moments of the trial were the most gripping. Anthony's fate would soon be sealed, and the people of Miami waited with bated breath, hoping that justice would prevail. But the question remained, could anything truly bring Marcus back from the hell that he had endured? And could Anthony ever truly come to terms with the violent act he had committed over something as meaningless as a parking space? In the end, the answer was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. For Marcus, for Anthony, for the city of Miami, the consequences of that fateful parking dispute would echo for years to come. The courtroom was silent. The tension was palpable, a heavy, suffocating air hanging over the proceedings. Everyone present knew that this was the final chapter of a story that had shaken the city. The parking dispute that had escalated into a shooting, a man's life on the line, and a community left reeling. The jury was now deliberating, and all eyes were on them, waiting for the verdict that would shape the rest of Anthony Russian's life. Marcus Reed sat at home, recovering from the physical wounds that had nearly taken his life. His body had healed, but the emotional scars lingered, unseen yet deeply felt. The trauma of that day, the terror, the pain, the shock, haunted him. He had always prided himself on being a peaceful person, a man who avoided conflict. But now, he found himself unable to shake the memory of that moment when everything changed. His mind kept replaying the sound of the gunshot, the crack of the bullet, the pain that followed, and then the darkness. He had nearly died that day, and though he was alive, a part of him had been forever altered. He hadn't been prepared for the emotional toll that this incident would take on him. The fear that had gripped him as he fought to stay conscious, the helplessness as he lay on the pavement, knowing his life was slipping away, had left him shattered. Marcus had been unable to find the answers he so desperately sought. Why had this happened to him? What had he done to deserve this? A parking spot, a space that, in the grand scheme of things, meant nothing, had cost him everything. His peace of mind, his sense of security, had been stolen by a single moment of anger. The weight of that reality pressed down on him every day. Meanwhile, Anthony Russian sat in a holding cell, the walls closing in on him. The world he knew, the world where his anger had dictated his actions, had crumbled. Now, all that remained was the trial, and the cold, harsh reality of what was about to come. His life had been a series of bad decisions, but this was different. This was a breaking point. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him, and no amount of denial could change the truth. But even as the trial came to its conclusion, something inside Anthony remained elusive, a part of him that still refused to accept full responsibility for what he had done. The defense had put up a fight. They had tried to paint him as a man who had lost control, a man whose anger had overwhelmed him in a moment of heat. But the jury wasn't buying it. They had seen the evidence, the surveillance footage, the witnesses, the callousness with which he had fired the gun. It was clear, Anthony Russian had made a choice that day. And that choice had forever altered the course of 2 lives. The courtroom doors swung open, and the jury filed in, their faces grim. The air in the room grew heavier. Anthony sat up straighter in his chair, his palms clammy, sweat trickling down his neck. He was no longer the man who had walked into that courtroom weeks ago. He was someone else now, someone who had been forced to face the consequences of his actions. The judge called the court to order, and the foreman of the jury stood, his voice steady but somber. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Anthony Russian, guilty of attempted murder in the 2nd degree." There it was. The moment of reckoning. A wave of shock passed over Anthony. His eyes widened, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. He had always thought he could escape the consequences, somehow outrun them, but now there was no running. He had been held accountable. And the weight of the verdict began to sink in, slowly at first, then all at once. The judge gave a stern look and addressed the court. "You will be sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The gravity of your actions has not been lost on this court. You took another man's life into your hands, and for that, you will pay the price." As the sentence was delivered, Anthony remained still, his face a mask of disbelief. This wasn't the life he had imagined for himself. He had always thought that his anger would be his shield, protecting him from the consequences of his behavior. But now it was clear, his rage had been his undoing. For Marcus Reed, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but it didn't erase the pain. As the weeks passed, he tried to move on with his life, but he couldn't shake the sense of unease that lingered in his chest. He had survived, yes, but he had also lost a part of himself that he wasn't sure he would ever get back. Every time he stepped outside, he felt a nagging sense of vulnerability, as though he was constantly on edge, waiting for something to happen again. The physical wounds had healed, but the emotional scars were far deeper, much harder to erase. He sought therapy, tried to rebuild the trust he had lost in the world around him, but some days felt like he was fighting an endless battle against the fear and anxiety that gripped him. And on those days, he thought about Anthony, about the man who had almost killed him over something so insignificant, something that should never have mattered. In the end, the case became a reminder of just how fragile the human mind can be. A single moment of rage could destroy everything. And sometimes, the smallest spark could ignite a fire that burned everything in its path. Miami, the city known for its beautiful beaches and vibrant life, had witnessed an ugliness that day, one that could never be undone. The parking spot that had ignited this deadly conflict seemed almost absurd in hindsight. Yet, it was a symbol of something deeper, an unchecked anger, a lack of control, and a world that seemed to grow ever more violent. For Anthony Russian, the years ahead would be spent in a cold, isolated cell, his future uncertain. The decisions he had made could never be taken back. And for Marcus, the healing process would be slow and painful. His life had been irrevocably changed, his perception of safety shattered. But at least he was alive, alive to fight another day, to rebuild, and to try and find a sense of peace in a world that had, for a moment, seemed anything but peaceful. But as the weeks turned into months, one truth remained: no one had come out of that confrontation unscathed. The parking dispute, insignificant in its origin, had ended up defining their lives forever. And the scars left by that day would not fade easily. Not for Marcus. Not for Anthony. And not for anyone who had been touched by the tragic events that followed. End of Story 2. Story 3. The quiet of the Long Island shoreline was disturbed that summer evening. The breeze carried a cold, sharp bite, the kind that made the hairs on your neck stand up. But nothing was more chilling than the discovery that had just been made. It wasn't the kind of thing that belonged on a peaceful beach, not the kind of thing that should ever be uncovered. Yet there it was, beneath the soft sand and scattered debris, the evidence of a horrifying truth. The first victim was found, and the world was forced to confront something it had long hoped was just an urban legend, a serial killer. They called him the Gilgo Beach Killer, though they didn't know his name. They didn't know the extent of his depravity, or the twisted path that would soon be revealed. The authorities had already been investigating the area, digging through the remains of a case that seemed to never get solved. Bodies were discovered, buried in shallow graves, hidden in plain sight. A grotesque puzzle, each piece more horrifying than the last. But it wasn't until 2024, when the true nature of the beast was revealed, that the nightmare began to take shape. Rex Hoyerman, a name that would soon be etched in the public consciousness, was identified as the prime suspect. A seemingly ordinary man, living in a suburban neighborhood, blending in with the rest of society. But behind his facade lay a dark, grotesque secret. He was a predator, and his hunting ground had been the beaches of Long Island. Authorities had long suspected that Hoyerman was responsible for the disappearances, but the evidence had been elusive, just out of reach. Now, with the discovery of Sandra Costilla's remains, the pieces began to fall into place. Hoyerman's reign of terror, it seemed, had spanned much longer than anyone had imagined. Sandra Costilla had disappeared years earlier, her family left in the dark, hoping and praying for her safe return. But she wasn't alone. The victims began to stack up, each one eerily similar in their tragic fate. Young women, vulnerable and desperate, pulled into a web of lies and deceit, never to be seen again. And yet, the true horror of what had been happening in that small corner of the world was still unfolding, one grisly revelation at a time. 4 years, the killer had moved like a shadow, a phantom lurking just beyond the horizon. His victims were mere echoes, their names lost to the void, swallowed by time and silence. Hoyerman had carefully crafted his persona, hidden behind layers of normalcy. He was a businessman, a man of the world, a father. The perfect cover for someone who was anything but ordinary. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just the story of one man's insanity. It was the chilling tale of how society had failed to see the signs, how the victim's cries had gone unheard. The killer's disturbing pattern became undeniable. Each victim was stripped of their dignity, discarded like trash, left to rot in the sands of Gilgo Beach. With every new piece of evidence, the horror deepened. The bodies were not only dumped in plain sight, they had been placed with purpose, arranged like pieces on a grotesque chessboard. A twisted game, where the stakes were human lives. Hoyerman had planned it all, and the timing of his acts, the way he struck at the most vulnerable moments, made it clear. This was no random act of violence. This was methodical, calculated, and disturbingly familiar. The authorities were scrambling, piecing together the scattered fragments of a nightmare that had been buried for decades. The revelations were more grotesque than anyone could have imagined, and each new discovery only made the horror deepen. The identity of Rex Hoyerman had been uncovered, but it wasn't enough. They still didn't understand the full scope of his depravity, the twisted game he had been playing for so long. For the families of the victims, each revelation felt like a new wound, fresh and raw. The pain of knowing that their loved ones had been discarded like trash, their bodies left to rot in the sands of Gilgo Beach, was unbearable. They had never imagined that a man they'd passed by on the street, a man who seemed like just another face in the crowd, could be the one responsible for their daughters' deaths. The investigation continued, but with each passing day, it seemed as if the answers were slipping further away. Hoyerman had been meticulous, methodical in his actions. He had known how to cover his tracks, how to bury the evidence, how to leave just enough behind to keep the authorities guessing. His victims had been chosen carefully, not by chance, but by design, each one a piece of his dark puzzle, each one a step in his sickening ritual. It wasn't until investigators dug deeper into Hoyerman's past that the true horror began to reveal itself. He had been active far longer than anyone had suspected, stretching back to the early 1990s, a time when the killings were still just whispers in the wind. The first victim they linked to him was Sandra Costilla, a woman whose disappearance had been written off as another tragic case of someone who had simply vanished. The authorities had no reason to suspect foul play. But now, with the discovery of her body, the pieces started to fit together in a way they hadn't before. Sandra had been one of many, a fleeting memory for most, lost in the fog of time. She was just another name, another missing person on a list that had grown far too long. But to Hoyerman, she had been more. She had been his first step, the beginning of his twisted spree. And the more they uncovered, the more it became clear. He had been active for decades, carefully choosing his victims, each one a piece of his dark collection. As the authorities dug deeper, they uncovered more bodies, more victims, each one a chilling reminder of Hoyerman's reign of terror. The beachfront, once a peaceful haven for families and tourists, had become a graveyard. The sand, once soft and inviting, had become the final resting place for those who had been silenced by a man who took pleasure in their suffering. The bodies were found in various stages of decay, some so badly mutilated that they were unrecognizable. The remains had been carefully buried, placed with purpose, a twisted ritual that only Hoyerman could understand. Each victim had been stripped of their humanity, left in the dirt like discarded playthings. But it wasn't just the bodies that haunted the investigators, it was the method behind the madness. Hoyerman had been playing a game, one that no one else could see. His victims weren't just random targets, they were part of something far more sinister. They were part of his obsession, his desire to control and dominate. He had a plan, a sickening vision of what he wanted to achieve, and each killing brought him closer to completing it. The authorities had been blind to the signs for so long. They had missed the patterns, overlooked the warning signs, dismissed the disappearances as coincidences. The women who had gone missing, whose bodies had been left behind to rot, had all been discarded as mere casualties in a world that had too many disappearances to care about. But now, as the truth came to light, it was clear that Hoyerman had been operating under the radar, slipping through the cracks, unnoticed by those who should have been paying attention. But what made the situation even more horrifying was the realization that Hoyerman had been right there, living among them all along. He was a man who had blended in perfectly with the community, someone who had been able to move in and out of society without ever drawing suspicion. He was a father, a husband, a businessman. To those who knew him, he was a normal man. But behind his mask of normalcy lay the face of a monster. As investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of Hoyerman's crimes, they began to realize that the timeline of his killings was even longer than they had first thought. He hadn't just been active in the 2000s. He had been killing for years, perhaps even decades. And the more they uncovered, the more they began to wonder how many victims had gone uncounted, how many lives had been lost to a man who had lived among them, unnoticed. The chilling truth began to emerge. Hoyerman's reign of terror had not been isolated to Gilgo Beach. His killings had spread across Long Island, stretching from the beaches to the suburbs, from one victim to the next. His lust for control and power had driven him to act without remorse, to discard lives like they meant nothing. The victims, each one a story of desperation and fear, had all been drawn into Hoyerman's trap by his manipulation. He had a way of drawing people in, of making them feel safe, only to turn on them when they least expected it. He was a master of deception, a predator who had studied his prey for years, learning everything he could about them before striking. For the families of the victims, the pain was unimaginable. They had lived in the dark for so long, hoping for closure, praying for answers. But now, as the truth came to light, it was clear that they would never truly get the closure they needed. Their loved ones had been taken, their lives cut short by a man who had shown no mercy, no compassion. The discovery of Sandra Costilla's body had been the final piece of the puzzle. It had opened the floodgates, revealing the full extent of Hoyerman's depravity. And as the investigation continued, it became clear that this was no ordinary case. This was the work of a man who had been hunting for years, a man who had found pleasure in the pain of others, a man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. And as the authorities pieced together the final details of his twisted reign, one question remained. How many more were out there? How many victims had been silenced by Hoyerman's hand? The nightmare was far from over, and for those who had lost so much, the true horror was only beginning. The more investigators dug, the more it became evident that Rex Hoyerman had woven a web of deception so tight that no one had ever suspected him. He had built an entire life around the most sinister of lies, a facade that concealed his true nature. His every move, every word, every gesture seemed so calculated, so perfectly ordinary. But underneath it all, he was a predator, hunting without mercy, his dark desires driving him to continue his reign of terror with terrifying precision. The horrors found at Gilgo Beach were just the tip of the iceberg. As the authorities pieced together the full scope of his crimes, chilling patterns emerged, each one more unsettling than the last. Rex had followed a disturbing rhythm in his killings, his victims chosen with a sickening sense of purpose. He wasn't just murdering women randomly, he was meticulously selecting them, studying their every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as they delved deeper into his past, the authorities realized just how long he had been operating. Years, decades even. His first victim, Sandra Costilla, had vanished in the early 90s, and since then, countless others had been claimed by his insatiable need to kill. There were no coincidences, no random choices. He had a plan. A twisted, horrifying plan that spanned years, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives, each one forgotten by the public, buried in the sands of Gilgo Beach, discarded as though they meant nothing. As investigators uncovered more evidence, the pieces of Hoyerman's life began to unravel. They discovered that he had kept a collection of photographs, eerie mementos from each of his victims. The photos were taken from the moments when they had been most vulnerable, often after he had lured them into his trap, promising them safety or shelter, only to betray them in the most horrific ways imaginable. His need to possess them, to control them, was insatiable. He didn't just kill for the sake of it. He killed to assert his power over them, to take away their humanity and make them part of his sick collection. The most unsettling revelation came when the investigators uncovered his online presence. Hidden in plain sight, just as he had always managed to blend into society. He had been frequenting online chat rooms and forums for years, participating in discussions about missing persons, giving false condolences, pretending to be just another concerned citizen. He had actively inserted himself into the public conversations about the disappearances, all while knowing that he was the one responsible. It was a chilling game for him, manipulating others while remaining in the shadows, watching the chaos unfold from behind the safety of his screen. As more victims were identified, the sheer magnitude of Hoyerman's twisted spree became clear. The authorities began to wonder just how many women had crossed paths with him over the years, unknowingly walking into the jaws of a predator. His pattern was clear. He targeted vulnerable women, those who were often struggling, lost, or simply trying to survive. He lured them in with false promises, pretending to be someone they could trust. And when they least expected it, he struck. But the most disturbing part of it all was how Hoyerman managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system. For decades, he had been under the radar, his crimes dismissed as random disappearances, his behavior unnoticed by those around him. He wasn't a man who raised suspicions. He was a ghost, moving through life without drawing a single eye. He had the perfect cover. He was a family man, a well-established businessman with a clean record, someone people would have no reason to doubt. Even the authorities had missed him. Investigators had long been focused on the wrong suspects, following false leads and chasing after shadows. They were unable to see what was right in front of them, a man who had carefully hidden his true self behind the mask of normality. But now, the truth was starting to unfold, piece by piece, and it was more horrific than anyone had ever imagined. Hoyerman was not just a serial killer. He was a predator who had been able to operate with impunity for years, never once raising a red flag, never once being caught. His ability to deceive, to manipulate, and to cover his tracks was unprecedented. He had been playing a game that no one even knew existed, a game where the stakes were human lives. And with each new revelation, the terror only grew. The more victims were discovered, the more it seemed like Hoyerman's reign of terror was far from over. There were whispers, rumors, unsettling theories that suggested he might still be active, still hunting, still adding to his collection of broken lives. The very thought was enough to send shivers down the spines of the investigators, but it was also a possibility they couldn't ignore. Could Hoyerman still be out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again? For the families of the victims, the nightmare wasn't over. It never would be. The discovery of their loved ones' bodies, their final resting places in the sands of Gilgo Beach, was only the beginning of their grief. 4 years, they had been waiting for answers, hoping for closure, but now, they realized that the truth was far worse than they could have imagined. Their loved ones had been taken by a man who had been hiding in plain sight, a man who had shown no mercy, no remorse. As Rex Hoyerman sat in his prison cell, awaiting trial, his fate uncertain, the questions lingered in the air like a thick fog. How many more had fallen victim to his twisted desires? How many lives had been stolen by a man who had never been suspected, never been questioned? The families of the victims could only hope for justice, for a reckoning that would never bring their loved ones back, but might, at least, bring an end to the nightmare that had stolen so much from them. But even as the authorities prepared to bring Hoyerman to trial, there was a growing sense of unease. The more they uncovered, the more they began to realize that the true scale of his crimes was far beyond what anyone had initially believed. Hoyerman wasn't just a killer. He was a symbol of the darkness that could lurk in anyone, a man who had been able to slip through the cracks and escape detection for years, blending into society with terrifying ease. The horror of Gilgo Beach was far from over. And as the investigation continued, one thing became clear. Rex Hoyerman wasn't the end of the story. He was only the beginning. The nightmare had just begun, and the full truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation into Rex Hoyerman's past continued to unfold. The authorities had managed to piece together an unsettling portrait of a man who had lived a life of darkness, hidden behind the mask of a family man, a businessman, someone who was seemingly ordinary in every way. But every clue they unearthed painted a more disturbing picture, revealing a predator who had spent years carefully orchestrating his murders and evading capture. The trial of Rex Hoyerman began to take shape, and as the world watched, the full weight of his crimes was about to be brought into the light. Prosecutors had gathered a mountain of evidence, including DNA, personal effects of the victims, photographs, and a chilling set of records from Hoyerman's online activity, each one further cementing his role in the murders. They knew they were dealing with a monster, one who had taken the lives of countless women, using his charm and false persona to lure them into his deadly grasp. But for the families of the victims, there would never be true justice. How could there be? No sentence, No punishment could ever undo the horror they had endured. They had waited years for answers, for any shred of closure that could give them peace. And now, they had it, but the cost was far too high. As Rex Hoyerman sat in the courtroom, his face stone-cold and devoid of emotion, it was clear that he felt nothing for the victims, their families, or the destruction he had caused. Throughout the trial, he remained silent, a man who had long ago detached himself from any sense of morality or empathy. To him, the victims were nothing more than objects, trophies in a twisted collection he had built over decades. But the prosecution was determined to make him face the consequences of his actions. They methodically presented the case against him, one piece of damning evidence at a time. The courtroom was a silent witness to the horrors Hoyerman had unleashed on the world, each victim's story laid bare for the world to see. As the trial drew to a close, it was clear that Hoyerman would not escape the wrath of justice. The evidence was undeniable, and the victims' families had shown remarkable strength, standing before the court and demanding justice for their loved ones. The jury deliberated for hours, but it was only a formality. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that Hoyerman was guilty. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and grief. Rex Hoyerman was found guilty on all charges: murder, kidnapping, and the countless other crimes he had committed over the years. The sentence was life without the possibility of parole, a fate that would see him locked away for the rest of his days, never again allowed to harm another soul. But even as the legal system delivered its judgment, there remained an unsettling silence. The families of the victims had won a small victory, but the darkness that had been unleashed in their lives would never be fully undone. No amount of justice could ever bring back their loved ones, restore the innocence that had been stolen from them, or heal the scars left by Hoyerman's reign of terror. Rex Hoyerman was taken from the courtroom in handcuffs, his face expressionless as he was escorted to prison. The world would soon forget his name, but the scars of his actions would remain, etched into the memories of those who had lost everything. And as the years passed, Gilgo Beach remained a silent witness to the horrors that had unfolded there. The bodies that had been uncovered were no longer just nameless victims. They were women with families, dreams, and lives that had been tragically cut short. And while Rex Hoyerman might have been locked away, the haunting legacy of his crimes would continue to haunt the sands of Gilgo Beach, a place forever marked by darkness. For the families, the pain never truly faded. They would live with the knowledge that their loved ones had been taken by a monster who had hidden in plain sight, a monster who had evaded justice for far too long. But in their grief, they found strength, and in their fight for justice, they found a way to honor the memory of the women who had been lost. They would not let their names be forgotten. As for Rex Hoyerman, locked away in his cell, he was nothing more than a shell of the man he had once been. The walls of his prison cell were his new reality, isolated, cut off from the world he had once walked freely. His empire of fear had crumbled, and the darkness he had carried with him was now his only companion. But even behind bars, he was not done. A man like Hoyerman never truly faces the consequences of his actions. He may have been physically contained, but the horror he had caused would never be erased. His name would live on in the annals of crime, a symbol of the evil that lurked just beneath the surface of ordinary life. The nightmare was over, for now. But the echoes of Rex Hoyerman's twisted reign would reverberate for generations to come, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist in the most unsuspecting of places. End of stories. And with that, we come to the end of tonight's chilling tale. The story of Rex Hoyerman serves as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface, even in the most unsuspecting places. Though justice has been served, the scars left behind by his actions will never truly heal. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of true crime. If this story disturbed you, if it kept you up at night, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mr. DarXnights for more terrifying tales that will leave you questioning what's lurking in the shadows. Stay safe, keep the lights on, and remember, the night is never truly silent. Until next time, sleep tight, if you can.